In the early 20s, Buster Keaton was one of Hollywood's top comedians. By the early 30s, like so many silent stars, he was fading from public memory. Fired by MGM, divorced, an alcoholic, he found himself increasingly alone. But as his character was tested in his films, so it would be tested in life. These were his treadmill years, but he and his talents would triumph. (1934). In Europe, Buster Keaton was still a much-loved figure. In this French feature, he hands out fake banknotes as advertising. Any hope the film would fulfill its promise was dashed. It never even reached America. Yet it had some unique Keaton touches.
Mon vieux chef.
The boat back to New York was met by a newsreel man who filmed comedian Jack Pearl, known as Baron Munchausen. Perhaps Keaton was reminded of the endless wisecracking of Jimmy Durante. Perhaps he was just weary and depressed. But intentionally or not, he sabotages the act.
My Aunt Sophie?
In the middle of the ocean. You got off to see your Aunt Sophie?
Yeah.
Now, how'd you get off?
I got off the boat, walked down, and went over to see her.
So you just walked...
Yeah.
Well, I see.
What is she doing then?
Uh-huh.
What was your Aunt Sophie doing in the middle of the ocean?
How do you know?
No.
Oh, well, I'll pick it up. All right.
There was my Aunt Sophie in the middle of the ocean.
What's she doing in the middle of the ocean?
Light housekeeping. In the middle. There she was.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, don't say nothing. Keaton, I don't like... You speak up. And I tell you something. There was a mermaid. She was playing the piano. She was teaching the fishes their scales. Why don't you say something? And another thing, you know, I saw one fish tuning the piano. You know what kind of fish that was?
I had the slightest idea. What?
A tuna fish.
Educational Pictures had invited Keaton to join them in 1933 and submerged his reputation in a series of cheap two-reelers made in 3 to 5 days. On his own comedies, he'd spent more than a month.
He made a series of about 12 of the educational films, and the only one he really thought was any good was called Grand Slam Opera.
Keaton was credited with the script for this film, with its parody of Fred Astaire. Keaton's director on the educationals was his childhood vaudeville friend, Charles Lamont.
Easy man to get along. You're a very intelligent man, incidentally. I valued his thoughts because I knew that he knew what he was talking about, and I accepted it. And that made me a smart director. I wasn't one of those directors that said, look, I'm the director, you just do what I tell you. I never did that to a person.
People wondered if Keaton had burned himself out. He seemed content to draw from the past. 30 years before, in vaudeville, he'd played this act with his father. A director who knew Keaton many years later was Anthony Simmons.
He borrowed from the great treasury of routines. Keaton was drawing all the time on his old experiences. He wasn't looking for new ideas. I mean, we'd actually discuss a scene and he'd say, well, I remember that we did so-and-so in the past. Why don't we try and do that here? I mean, he was looking for his old successes, his old experience, to readapt those.
Bellboy, 1918. Love Nest on Wheels, 1937. The Goat, 1921. Blue Blazes, 1936. a horse used to pull a hotel elevator. Love Nest on Wheels. This is Buster's sister, Louise. From boyhood, Keaton had felt he had to support his family, but now he was bankrupt. The family was given work on 2 educational pictures.
That old man Potts down the village says unless we pay that $350 mortgage, we'll be moving. Where are we going to get $350?
Facing enormous bills which he couldn't pay, Keaton turned more and more to drink. It helped bring his second marriage to an end. He was divorced from May Scribbins in 1935. He left to make a feature in England for a refugee from Central Europe.
That was Sam Spiegel, one of his first efforts. And once again, going into it, he knew it wasn't going to be any good, and he just did it for the money.
The director, Adrian Brunel, was handed this note about Keaton by Spiegel's assistant. Don't let him drink.
And I'm afraid that Buster was on the bottle, and had been on the bottle for a number of years. And it was quite obvious during the filming that he'd got a lot of hangovers every day.
Keaton went back early to the United States and suffered a complete collapse. Doctors gave him a choice, give up alcohol or die. For 5 years, he never touched another drop. In 1937, he returned to MGM, his salary a stark contrast to the old days. For now, he was just a humble gag writer.
A reporter who should have known better asked him how it felt to be making $300 a week where he used to make $3,000. And Buster said, well, if I'm worth more, they'll pay me more.
Nothing sulky or rueful about him. He was just 100%, just really trying and really and doing it, because he, as I say, he knew exactly what he was doing. He gave gags to all those guys, to the Marx Brothers.
Even before Keaton worked with the Marx Brothers, a sequence from The Cameraman, with he and Ed Brophy in a changing cubicle, had inspired one of their most famous scenes.
Stuart? Ah, come right ahead. Hey, Stuart, the food. Waiting all afternoon. Hey, come to the boat. Come on.
It was an event when you could get all 3 of them on the set at the same time. The minute you started a picture with the Marx Brothers, you hired 3 assistant directors. 1 for each Marx brother. Get 2 of them while you went to look for the third one of the first 2 would disappear. They never worried what the next setup was going to be or what the routine or anything else is. We'll ad lib it when we get there. Abbott and Costello. But they says, when do we come and what do we wear? Then they find out that they start to shoot the picture what the script's about.
Yes.
Didn't worry about it. They didn't try to. Well, that used to get my goat because, my God, when we made pictures, we ate, slept, and dreamed of.
Go on, hit him, Buster. We're running out of film. Hit him.
Those days were over. When Hollywood paid its own kind of tribute to the silent era, Keaton was cast as something he never was, just another pie-throwing clown. This film within a film was directed by Mal St. Clair, who brought in Keaton both to act and co-direct. The girl is Alice Faye. The sequence was a tribute to comedy pioneer Max Sennett and his Keystone Cops. Keaton was happy to help out. He never asked for a credit. Keaton was generous with gags. In the charity baseball games for Mount Sinai Hospital, he always led the comedians' team.
Buster would arrive at the game with his gag men and his truck with props that he had fixed up, that he had worked out, and things would happen.
Picture welder Mary Pickford started the ball rolling. Michelin Durante on the hitter.
A critical moment with Buster Keaton up.
What a swipe, but luckily Buster Keaton was in the field. In fact, he's in the outfield.
In 1939, Columbia pushed him into doing pale imitations of Harold Lloyd and other comedians. Jules White directed the series, and Keaton disliked them all except the first, a remake of The Invader in 2 reels instead of 6,
Don't go away, I'll be right back.
and directed by an old friend, Del Lord.
Del was one director who adapted well to sound and had what I considered a very fine rapport with Buster Keaton. They conferred, seemed to agree, and in my opinion turned out a pretty good picture considering the budget limitations of any Columbia two-reeler.
In a little Spanish town, 'twas on a night like this. Stars were peekabooing down, 'twas on a night like this. I whispered, "Be true to me," and she smiled, see. Many skies have turned to gray because we're far apart. Many moons have passed away and still she's in my heart. We made a promise and sealed it with a kiss. In a little Spanish town, 'twas on a night like this.
In 1940, Keaton married a young MGM dancer, Eleanor Norris. The marriage transformed his life.
Her devoted wife, 16 years ago, Mrs. Keaton.
Here's a pretty
Come on, sit here, Buster. What have these...
I know.
Fix it up there, Mommy. What have these years of marriage to Buster meant, Eleanor?
Well, we've been very happy. Of course, we've had some lean times, too. But Buster's been so happy he's wanted to go back to work. And I've been very proud of the way he's come back into prominence.
You bet. And America's happy to have him back. You developed an act so that Eleanor could appear with you, didn't you, Buster?
Did you rehearse this?
He always seemed like he was helpless. And everyone assigned themselves to be his father. Joe Skank did. His doctor. He had 2 or 3 mothers. But he just seemed like a helpless type that everybody thought he needed caring for.
In his silent films, Keaton used this as part of his character. He seemed equally helpless with money. In Sherlock Jr., he finds a dollar bill.
He didn't carry any money. He didn't necessarily want to carry any money.
In fact, he was not a businessman. He didn't want to make decisions. He didn't want to make business decisions. There was always somebody doing it for him.
When we decided to get married, the doctor and the other friend took me aside separately, and for about 2 hours each, to convince me all the reasons why I should not marry him. And I listened to all of it very carefully, and we went and got married. But they were protecting him from me. He'd had enough trouble. He didn't need me. So, 28 years later, if they'd been around, they would have been surprised, I think.
MGM decided to remake some of Keaton's old films with Red Skelton. This was a remake of The General.
Hold your fire!
Keaton adapted some of his old gags for this scene. An earlier Skelton film ran into script trouble. Skelton found himself in Esther Williams' house, trapped by her dog.
Red tried to get out, the dog wouldn't let him. He put on Esther's clothes, the dog wouldn't let him get out. And he had to get out somehow. And we didn't know how to work it. So I said, we'll call Buster. And Buster came down and he looked at it, and like that, he said, I'll tell you what you can do. But it was like magic.
1949, Buster Keaton was in the news again. He was officially rediscovered. Life magazine published a tribute to the great silent comedians by James Agee. Suddenly, Buster was in demand by a new medium.
Buster was delightful in the days when he was riding the crest, the 20s, and he's still a delight today. He's here with us tonight, and now he's going to do on our stage the very first scene that he ever did in a motion picture. Tonight he's going to do it with Billy Gilbert.
As in the original, the molasses have been poured into the hat, then back again, without Buster realizing. The obvious delight of the live audience was an inspiration to Keaton. It took him back to his youth in vaudeville. Even though he was now well into his 50s, Keaton added a stunt not in the original film.
It was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun.
When Keaton started his own TV series, it was live. Then he was asked to do a second.
And they started on the second series, found out that we're going to do it just with a motion picture camera without an audience. And for some reason, this just cannot be done with this type of picture. And I wouldn't re-sign again to commence with. I knew what I was up against, trying to make that weekly show and dig up new material. Well, it just can't be done. You can't dig it up that fast. It isn't a case of how many writers you can hire. So I was contented to do nothing but guest shots from then on. Television meant that live audience.
In his television appearances, Eleanor was now his regular partner.
He was very precise, very mathematical in his work, and I had to be the same. Just like all other so-called leading ladies of his, I was just one more prop to be handled and thrown around and dumped on my head or whatever happened to be called for.
Eleanor went with Buster on two of his engagements at the Cirque Medrano in Paris.
The circus, like he imagined it, like an American circus, a big tent with 5,000 or 10,000 people in it. He was very scared. He thought of that. He was scared. But when he saw the place, he changed his mind, because my place was very small and Paris was 1,500 people.
The clowns in the show used to gather in the entranceway in the shadows, watching him each night.
The clowns learned from Keaton, for in each of his acts, he directed them.
Oh, yes, he directed. He was quiet doing it, and he'd more or less get hold of you. He wouldn't, rather than talk, he'd come and get hold of you and put you where he wanted you. And then he'd do all get hold of you kind of a thing, and move me round, tell me where to walk and where to stand, which shoulder to stand behind.
Myself and the other clowns, amazed. That's about the only thing that I can see.
In England, Keaton toured the music halls. He appeared with veterans of the great days like George Robey and Hetty King. The most famous veteran of all, Charles Chaplin, gave Keaton a role in his story of the English music halls, Limelight. It was the only time they appeared together. Paramount decided there was a movie in Keaton's life story. It was a work of fiction. Advisor he may have been, but no one acted on his advice.
So right from the beginning, what Buster was telling them, it was going in one ear and out the other, and they really didn't follow any of this magnificent story of Buster. They labored on the thing of the drinking period, and I think everybody here has had a drinking problem one time or another, has had a lot of fun with booze, but that wasn't the paramount thing with him.
There were moments of Buster. In his Sherlock Jr., to escape from gangsters, he'd used an old stage trick of his father's. His faithful aide dresses as a peddler woman. Donald O'Connor duplicated the trick.
And it was a marvelous trick, and it was very dangerous. You'd have to go from sunlight into this dark hole and lay out straight. There was no way to tuck and roll out of it. You had to lay out straight and worry about catching the back of your head going through the hole. When I dove through this tray that he was holding, they would let his legs down from the back of the wall, and the wall would close this way, and there was buckshot on the bottom of his skirt, and he'd walk away from the wall, and the camera would be on this blank wall. Because with Keaton around, standing watching, you'll have this feeling nothing's going to happen to you if he's around.
The Buster Keaton story paid for a modest house and a plot of land in the San Fernando Valley, where Keaton was to spend the last 10 years of his life. He called it his ranch. He surrounded himself with gadgets and machinery. Many people said that if Keaton hadn't been an actor, he might have been a civil engineer.
First time I met Buster, I went out to his house, and Eleanor said he's out in the garage, and incidentally, he's trying to quit smoking. I said, oh, really? Okay, I won't smoke around him then. So I went out in the garage, and this was Buster's idea of giving up smoking. He had a little train. He was working on something at the bench. He had a little train that went around, all the way around inside the garage. So when I walked in, he had just taken a puff off his cigarette, and he put it on the train. And it slowly went around, all the way around inside. And when he stopped it, and then he took another puff on the cigarette. But it was his idea. That was taking all this time to get around. That was his idea, giving up smoking.
He had tracks that ran out, made a giant circle around a picnic table, and then back into the garage again. One car would carry 3 hard-boiled eggs, and another would carry a hot dog and pickles and radishes and olives and all kinds of things. And he had this whole freight train that was full of food, and he would take it out around the picnic table and stop it so everybody could take what they wanted. And sometimes it was pretty strange. You'd open my refrigerator in the kitchen, and there'd be nothing in there except freight train full of food waiting to go out.
The new owner of the Italian villa, Buster's previous home, was James Mason, who made a surprising discovery in the basement, a pile of films which Keaton had left behind. This brought Keaton into contact with Raymond Roja. Roja ran his own art theater in Los Angeles, and one night Keaton attended a showing of The General. The meeting began a new career for Roja and a new adventure for Keaton, who never thought his old films would survive.
I've never noticed Buster Keaton to have an ego. He just felt that the public wasn't interested in himself anymore. And he couldn't understand why I was interested in saving the films.
The films were on nitrate stock, which is both inflammable and subject to chemical decomposition. This would have been the fate of his two-reeler, The Boat. Roja transferred it to safety stock in the nick of time. A classic moment of film comedy, almost lost by decomposition, is the great day of the launch. In the 1950s, a new field opened up for Keaton.
Keep a full tank. Fire up with Firebird at the Big Blue Pure Oil sign.
When you order a beer, ask the man to draw Simon Pure. The happier, hoppier beer.
And today, my pet is making commercials. It's easy work for me. Do them quick and stay home here and enjoy life.
This parody of commercial star Barbara Feldon was never shown. It was intended for Hudnut shampoos. The rushes have only just been discovered. Keaton was invited to be a guest on Candid Camera.
Now watch the pepper, the top will come off. His wristwatch went in his soup.
The first thing he said was that I could do some funny things while I'm having breakfast. And I said, well, that's wonderful. Do you need any props? He said, no, nothing. Zero. I said, well, why don't you try it once and I'll get an idea of what it looks like. We roll that camera.
I notice this lady has a husband sitting next to her. You don't see him right now, but he's telling her what's going on because she's too embarrassed to watch. Look out.
Buster adored it. There he was, working, not on stage, but it was a practical joke. And, you know, he loved practical jokes, and that's the way he considered it.
Watch carefully, carefully.
One gag right after another, and one take, and that was all. He's truly a genius.
Apart from television, Keaton returned to the theatre for a series of road shows. In Merton of the Movies, a film had to be shown on stage.
They started out by renting some kind of film to be used in the second act, and it didn't make any sense at all. It had nothing to do with Buster or what we were doing. So we got I had my movie camera with me, my little 16mm camera. So we went out and made our own home movie with the slate numbers on and everything, because in the play, they were supposed to be looking at the rushes.
This film hasn't been seen for 30 years. In 1959, Keaton received an Oscar for his unique talents which brought immortal comedies to the screen. Hollywood might give him an award, a film was another matter. Anthony Simmons tried to set up a feature with Keaton the same year.
Nobody in the UK wanted to know at all. And we approached United Artists, and we got their backing from New York. If they could write it off against Europe, they couldn't guarantee a film with Keaton for £22,000 on the UK market.
The film was eventually made with Peter Sellers.
And it wasn't me, it wasn't the script they were afraid of. It was Keaton they were afraid of. And I find that very sad.
In 1960, Keaton and Rohar paid a visit to the French Cinematheque in Paris, where an amateur cameraman took these shots. A handful of Keaton films were shown by archives and film societies, and Keaton had a small but loyal following. The warmth and enthusiasm they received encouraged Rohar to plan the launch of the first Keaton reissue in Europe. Rohar arranged a tour of Germany in 1962 for Keaton's favorite film, The General.
And The General was selected by Buster himself as the film because he felt that, for many reasons, that if the public was going to accept him at all, that they would accept him in that film. And he was so right. Buster loved anything that was mechanical. In planning the tour, he was a part of planning it. And the fact that we brought this engine, it's an old engine from Vienna, and suddenly he becomes fired up with the idea that he could throttle the train himself into the each train station, because we had a tour of 20 German cities.
The trainmen were the ones that would go into shock. When Buster would get on the train, he'd say, "Are you ready? Okay, let's go." And they're going, "Ah," you know, he's driving our train, he's going to crash our train.
The General would now confound its original critics. It was instantly recognized for the classic it was. The first show was in Munich.
We could hear the laughter of the people out in the street. And Buster said, "What are they laughing at?" I said, "That your picture." He couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe it. This is the reaction of the people. So I said, "Well, let's go over and see it." He said, "Oh, no, I don't want to go into the theater. No, I don't." He said, I never go in to see my own films with an audience. Never. And she said, "He's right. He won't do it." She said, "Ray, you can talk all day. He won't do it." So I said, well, Eleanor, why don't you and I go over? And Buster said, all right, I'll wait for you.
So we had reserved seats in the balcony, and the two of us went charging up the stairs to see what was causing all the riot. And it was cops. They were running cops ahead of the general. And I never heard such yelling in my life. Couldn't believe it. They just loved every inch of it.
Back to Buster, and then Eleanor was all enthusiastic. Now she said, "Oh, Buster, it's hard to believe, but they're really laughing at you, your comedy, and you." And she said, "Oh," he didn't say anything; he just listened. And then we went back to the hotel. So I said to him that same day, I said, "Did you ever believe that you would see your name on a marquee, as a star like that again?" He said, "No." He said, "I never thought it would happen."
The General inspired a young British director working for the National Film Board of Canada, Gerald Potterton. He met Keaton in a New York hotel.
And I said, well, we want you to basically get on one of these little railway cars and go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. He said, sounds crazy, I'll do it. Then there was a lot of noise coming from outside in Central Park. And he got up, went over to the window, lifted the window up, and yelled out, "Quiet!" to the whole of Manhattan, closed the window, sat down and said, "When do we start?"
The National Film Board had the good sense to make a film about the production, and they caught the intensity with which Keaton treated his work. Because of the danger, he's just been told that his gag, crossing a trestle bridge 200 feet up, enveloped by a huge map, has been dropped in favor of another. Instinctively, he talks the language of a film director.
What makes it tough is that I can't match scenes. Because I didn't have it in my mind that way, so I don't know. If I went back now to protect this chase and close-ups, I wouldn't have the slightest idea what I was doing at the time I should be doing it. So I can't make scenes match.
Don't forget, there's still two other shots to complete the sequence, Buster. There's a long shot of the bridge with them going over. That's the whole center of the gag is that long shot of the bridge.
No, the bridge is not your gag. The bridge is only suspense. Took a good look.
Keaton was not a stubborn man, but very occasionally he'd dig his heels in. And when that happened, no one could talk him round.
Said it was too dangerous.
He says, who suggested the gag? He says, you did. He says, I generally know what I'm doing. That is not dangerous. That's child's play. Well, how about mine?
Don't tell me about it.
I told that. I do worse things in my sleep than that. I say, anytime you're shooting gags or laying them out in advance, you so often run into guesswork. Or maybe his way's better than doing it mine. And you try to sell yourself one way or the other because there is a certain amount of guess. Has to be. But every now and then ain't no guesswork. This is one of them.
Keaton won the day.
Fantastic practical jokes person. If he's standing by a locomotive coming to a slow stop, he would catch hold of the bar and stop it. And it really looked like he had stopped this, 150-ton locomotive. And I think that's the thing that really
sort of got to people working with him was his natural ability to think up natural gags.
I would like to wish you many happy returns of the day, October the 4th, 1964. Also, the Queen sends her regards.
Cheers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I'm not very good at public speaking, so... But to show you that me heart's in the right place, I'll fight any man in the house.
I loved Keaton. He was everything that you felt a great film comedian should be, both on and off the screen, and that was fantastic to find out. You know, somebody that was a god to you was in fact a god.
An experimental film written by Samuel Beckett, directed by Alan Schneider, featured Keaton. It was virtually without sound. But now Buster was nearly 70, and his health was failing rapidly. The part required him to wear a heavy overcoat in the New York summer.
The working conditions were abominable. Poor Buster, it was 110 degrees under the Brooklyn Bridge, and we weren't under the Brooklyn Bridge. We were alongside of it. And Buster was running. And it was all broken bricks. He never complained. The man, I'm not making him into a saint. It was true. He just simply could take any amount of pain and travail.
Beckett's film was invited to the Venice Film Festival. And so was Keaton. Roja persuaded him to endure the barrage of publicity for the sake of the reissue of the films.
Signor Keaton, when you get the first-time idea to appear...
His voice tells us how ill he was.
Well, it wasn't an idea. You see, I was born with a show.
Ecco, nessuna idea. Sono nato nel teatro e sono un figlio d'arte.
Helena knew that too many interviews would quickly exhaust him.
E qui ad aspettare la lasciamo alla sua...
And she knew his aversion to crowds.
He was very shy, and he just could not stand crowds. He would absolutely panic if he saw crowds coming at him.
But what I didn't know was that how much the press is really interested in Keaton, because that, of course, we didn't know until the day arrived.
Buster and Eleanor greet Roja in Venice. The previous year, the festival had staged a retrospective of his work, so he was keenly awaited at the Sala Grande.
So when we got to the auditorium, I said, come on, we have to go in here. He said, what are we going in there for? I said, he said, I thought we were going to go to the hotel. I said, yeah, but we have to stop off and say hello to the director of the festival. He's in this building. I said, just go through this door. So I opened the door, and everybody in the room stood up, turned around to the back door, and started applauding Buster Keaton. And I had to push him in, because he wouldn't go. I pushed him in the back into the auditorium, so we had no choice.
Keaton stomped onto the stage, surrounded by various festival officials, sat down in the table in the middle of the stage and just glared at us, unsmiling. Then, by some sort of curious mass will, we all got up and moved down into the front of the theatre. You know, somebody shouted out, "Caro Buster." Photographers shouted out, "Look this way." It clambered up onto the stage like all the Italian photographers do. Keaton remained passive on the stage. The applause grew. There was a great deal of shouting. It was sort of joyful pandemonium for a moment. And then, slowly, a little smile came over his face, and he bent forward and said, "Glad to see you." And from that moment on, the whole thing was, you know, very mellow and nice.
And so we're walking to the hotel, and Buster started to get a coughing spell, and his coughing got worse. And so we sat there for a few minutes, and he said, now I want you to pick and choose who I have to talk to. He said, but I can't do many. So the first person that came to me was James Blue and John Gill.
We finished the interview, and we were just about to go, and Keaton moved over to the door at the end of this room, as I say, leading into the bar, took out his handkerchief and just very neatly started wiping the glass on the top of the door. And again, we said goodbye, and then he gave us a rather wicked look, and to our amazement, put his head through where the glass should have been, his hand, and opened the door from the other side. No glass there at all.
The same year, Keaton played in a comedy of ancient Rome, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, directed by Richard Lester.
He was just the first person that enchanted me totally in terms of sitting in the cinema and watching films. And I didn't really know anything about what the cinema had to offer until I started seeing Keaton's films. And I was just overwhelmed by what he did. So when the opportunity came up to have the chance of working with him, I leapt at it because he, to me, was the master.
A press conference made further demands on Keaton's stamina.
The fact that he was dying was a shock. But nobody seemed to realize quite what state he was in. And in fact, he didn't either. He thought he had a rather advanced case of asthma.
Only through Dick Lester giving me permission to say this that I doubled him, because the man was ill. I mean, he was dying, you know. I would never have said it, because anyway, if I said it in cold blood to anybody that I work with, you know, oh yeah, I doubled Buster Keaton, no, they'd lock you up.
This is Mick Dillon avoiding the chariots. This is Keaton. Dillon. But the last gag is Keaton's.
The most refreshing climate in the world.
Like a brick wall. He ran straight into the tree and, you know, took everybody's breath away. Oh, what's it? We thought he hadn't seen it, but that was the way he did it. He just ran straight into it with his head. Bang. Out. Marvellous.
Keaton's last appearance on the screen was in an industrial safety film made in Canada, The Scribe.
He had caught a cold making a commercial up in Canada. He thought that's what it was, a bad cold and pains and bronchial pains and one thing and another. Actually, it was cancer of the lung. It was so far gone, it was inoperable.
We never told him what was the matter with him. He thought he had chronic bronchitis. And outside of having really bad coughing spells, where he'd be almost totally out of breath, everything, you know, he just kept getting progressively weaker. And we played bridge all afternoon the day before he died.
One heart.
When he was ready to be buried, he had a rosary in one pocket and, and a deck of cards in the other, so he was set for whichever direction he was going.
I've often said that if I ever got up to the pearly gates myself and looked in, and there was only one person in there, it would be my grandmother, but I had to correct that. There'd have to be two people in there, because one of them would be my grandmother and the other would be Buster Keaton. He was, for my money, one of the grandest men that was ever put on this earth.
Well, it was a great life. Sure it was.